On a crisp September morning in 1997, Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her two beloved Shire horses, Thunder and Storm, would become the unlikely heroes who accidentally saved Queen Elizabeth II from a potential security disaster. What began as a simple mishap involving escaped horses and royal flower arrangements would uncover a sinister plot that had been months in the making. The massive hooves that trampled through carefully arranged roses and delphiniums didn't just destroy a garden display, they revealed hidden wires, suspicious packages, and evidence that would lead Scotland Yard to one of the most sophisticated assassination attempts in British royal history. Sometimes the most extraordinary events begin with the most ordinary moments, and sometimes it takes a ton of horseflesh to prevent a national tragedy. This is the true story of how two gentle giants accidentally became guardians of the crown, and how their owner, a struggling single mother from Yorkshire, found herself at the center of an international incident that would change her life forever. Sarah Mitchell's alarm clock screamed at 5:30 in the morning, just as it had every day for the past 3 years. She rolled over in her narrow bed, her back aching from another night spent on the lumpy mattress she couldn't afford to replace. Through the thin walls of her cottage, she could already hear Thunder and Storm moving restlessly in their paddock. The massive Shire horses seemed to sense when dawn was approaching, their internal clocks more reliable than any timepiece. The September air carried a sharp bite that promised autumn's arrival. Sarah pulled on her worn Wellington boots and grabbed the thick wool sweater that had belonged to her late husband Michael. The sleeves were too long and the color had faded from navy to a tired grey, but it still smelled faintly of his cologne, and wearing it made her feel less alone in the world. Outside, the Yorkshire countryside stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills dotted with sheep and divided by ancient stone walls that had stood for centuries. The Mitchell farm sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by fields that had once been prosperous but now struggled to turn a profit. Sarah's small herd of sheep barely covered the mortgage payments, and the vegetable garden that fed her and her 8-year-old daughter Emma was more necessity than hobby. Thunder and Storm stood waiting by the gate, their breath visible in the cool morning air. These weren't just any horses. Shire horses were living giants, standing nearly 18 hands high and weighing close to a ton each. Their feathered feet were the size of dinner plates, and their gentle brown eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved visitors. Thunder was black with white markings on his face and legs, while Storm was a rich chestnut brown with a flowing mane that caught the morning light. Sarah had inherited the horses from her father-in-law, along with the farm and its mounting debts. Most people thought she was crazy for keeping such enormous animals when she could barely afford to feed herself and Emma. But these horses were her connection to Michael, to his family's history, and to a way of life that was rapidly disappearing from the English countryside. The horses had been bred for heavy work, pulling brewery wagons through London streets and working the fields before tractors made them obsolete. Now they were mostly show animals, living reminders of a time when horsepower meant actual horses. Sarah couldn't afford to show them, but she loved them with a fierce protectiveness that surprised even herself. This particular morning, Sarah noticed something different in Thunder's behavior. The massive stallion was pacing along the fence line, his ears pricked forward with unusual alertness. Storm seemed agitated too, pawing the ground and nickering softly. Sarah had learned to trust the horse's instincts. They often sensed things long before she did, whether it was approaching storms or unwelcome visitors. She filled their water troughs and checked their hay supply, all while trying to figure out what had them so unsettled. The countryside was quiet except for the distant bleating of sheep and the occasional call of a crow. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the horses remained on edge. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for school in her uniform of navy skirt and white blouse. At 8 years old, she had her father's dark hair and serious brown eyes that seemed too old for her face. She'd grown up fast since Michael's death, taking on responsibilities that no child should have to bear. "Mum, Thunder's making that noise again," Emma said, buttering a piece of toast with practiced efficiency. Sarah paused in her morning routine. Thunder did make a particular sound when he was worried, a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep in his chest. She'd heard it before storms, before the vet arrived to treat Storm's colic, and most memorably, on the night before Michael's accident. "I heard it too, love. Probably just excited about their breakfast." Sarah tried to keep her voice light, but Emma was too perceptive to be easily fooled. The morning routine continued with mechanical precision. Emma caught the school bus at 7:15, and Sarah waved goodbye from the kitchen window, watching until the yellow vehicle disappeared around the bend. The cottage felt impossibly quiet without Emma's chatter, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the growing sense that something was amiss. She decided to take Thunder and Storm out for exercise earlier than usual. The horses needed work to stay healthy, and the physical activity might calm whatever had them agitated. The bridle paths that crisscrossed the Yorkshire countryside were perfect for long, peaceful rides that cleared both her head and theirs. Tacking up 2 Shire horses was always an undertaking. Their bridles were enormous, their bits the size of serving spoons, and their saddles required considerable strength to lift. Sarah had developed impressive arm muscles over the years, though she was still dwarfed by the animals she cared for. Standing next to Thunder, she barely reached his shoulder. The morning ride started like dozens of others. They followed the familiar path that led through the oak woods, past the abandoned mill, and along the river that marked the boundary between her property and the neighboring estate. The horses seemed to relax once they were moving, their ground-covering stride, eating up the miles with surprising grace for such large animals. It was during their return journey that Sarah first noticed the unusual activity near Thornfield Manor. The grand estate had been sold 6 months earlier to a private company that claimed to be developing it as a luxury hotel. Construction vehicles had been coming and going ever since, but this morning was different. There were more people than usual, and they seemed to be focused on the formal gardens rather than the main building. Sarah guided Thunder to a stop beside a gap in the hedgerow that provided a clear view of the manor's grounds. What she saw made her frown with confusion. Workers were installing elaborate flower arrangements throughout the gardens, far more ornate than anything a hotel renovation would require. The displays were magnificent, with towering spires of delphiniums, carefully arranged beds of roses, and artistic groupings of exotic blooms that must have cost a fortune. More puzzling was the presence of several men in dark suits who were clearly not gardeners. They moved with the alert posture of security personnel, speaking into small devices and constantly scanning their surroundings. Sarah counted at least 6 of them positioned around the garden perimeter. Thunder shifted restlessly beneath her, his ears swiveling toward the manor grounds. Storm, usually the calmer of the two, was also showing signs of agitation. Both horses seemed drawn to something at the estate, something Sarah couldn't identify. The rational part of her mind suggested that Thornfield Manor was simply preparing for an important event. Perhaps they were hosting a grand opening for wealthy investors, or maybe filming a period drama that required authentic Victorian gardens. The flower arrangement certainly looked like something from a royal garden party. But the horse's behavior suggested otherwise. In her experience, Thunder and Storm had an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. They'd warned her about the loose electrical wire that could have started a barn fire, and they'd refused to cross the old stone bridge 2 days before it partially collapsed during a flood. Sarah decided to investigate further, but carefully. She guided the horses along the public footpath that ran closer to the manor's boundary. The path was perfectly legal to use, though she'd never had much reason to venture this way before. As they drew nearer, more details became visible. The flower arrangements weren't just beautiful, they were strategically positioned in patterns that seemed almost military in their precision. Each display was exactly the same distance from the next, creating a grid across the manor's lawn. Stranger still, each arrangement appeared to be connected by thin wires that were nearly invisible against the grass. The men in dark suits had noticed her presence. One of them raised a pair of binoculars in her direction, while another spoke urgently into his communication device. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Whatever was happening at Thornfield Manor, her presence wasn't welcome. She turned the horses away from the path, intending to head home and forget what she'd seen. But Thunder had other ideas. The massive stallion suddenly wheeled toward the manor grounds, his ears pinned back in a way Sarah had never seen before. Storm followed his lead, and before Sarah could regain control, both horses were charging toward the estate's ornamental fence. Shire horses weren't known for jumping, but when Thunder decided to go somewhere, very little could stop him. The ornamental fence was only 4 feet high, more decorative than functional, and Thunder cleared it easily despite his size. Storm followed a heartbeat later, and Sarah found herself in the middle of Thornfield Manor's perfectly manicured grounds, surrounded by expensive flower arrangements and very angry security personnel. What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. Thunder, moving with purpose that seemed almost deliberate, began systematically destroying the nearest flower display. His massive hooves crushed roses and scattered petals across the lawn, but more importantly, they revealed what had been hidden beneath the arrangements. Thin wires, electronic components, and small packages wrapped in waterproof material were embedded throughout the flower beds. As Thunder's hooves tore through the careful camouflage, Sarah glimpsed enough to understand that these weren't simple garden decorations. They were sophisticated pieces of equipment, hidden in plain sight among the blooms. Storm joined the destruction with enthusiasm that was completely out of character for the normally gentle giant. Between them, the 2 horses demolished. 3 entire flower displays in less than a minute, leaving behind a scene that looked like a battlefield decorated with rose petals and delphinium fragments. The men in dark suits were shouting now, some running toward the horses while others spoke rapidly into their communication devices. Sarah heard fragments of urgent conversation. Operation compromised and abort sequence, and most chillingly, the package has been exposed. Sarah finally managed to regain control of the horses, pulling them to a halt near the center of the manor's lawn. Around her, the evidence of whatever plot had been hidden among the flowers lay scattered in the morning sunlight. Electronic devices, timing mechanisms, and packages that she was beginning to suspect contained something far more dangerous than flower food. One of the security men approached her, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Miss, you need to leave immediately. This is private property." "I'm sorry," Sarah began, but her apology was cut short by the sound of approaching sirens. Police cars and what looked like military vehicles were racing up the manor's long driveway, their lights flashing against the morning sky. Thunder and Storm stood calmly now, as if their work was complete. They'd done what they came to do, though Sarah still didn't understand what that was or why it had been necessary. All she knew was that her quiet morning ride had somehow transformed into the center of what appeared to be a major security operation. As the first police officers reached them, Sarah caught sight of movement in the manor's upper windows. Figures in dark clothing were moving rapidly through the rooms, and she could hear the sound of vehicles starting up behind the building. Whatever had been planned for Thornfield Manor, the arrival of 2 Shire horses had apparently disrupted it completely. The lead police officer, a tall woman with sergeant's stripes, approached with her hand resting casually on her radio. "Are you Sarah Mitchell?" The question surprised Sarah. How did they know her name? "Yes, but I don't understand what's happening here. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning. Your horses may have just prevented a terrorist attack." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Terrorist attack? The flower arrangements, the hidden equipment, the men in dark suits? It was starting to make a terrible kind of sense. But how had Thunder and Storm known? And why had they chosen this morning to act so completely out of character? As she was led away from the scene, Sarah looked back at the destruction the horses had caused. What had appeared to be senseless vandalism was beginning to look like something entirely different. The scattered electronic components glinted in the strengthening sunlight, evidence of a plot that might have succeeded, if not for 2 horses with an inexplicable ability to sense danger. The morning that had started so normally was turning into something that would change everything. Sarah Mitchell, struggling single mother and owner of 2 Shire horses, was about to become a key witness in one of the most significant security operations in recent British history. And she still had no idea why her horses had known to act when they did, or what larger forces had been set in motion by their morning ride through the Yorkshire countryside. The police station in Harrogate buzzed with an energy Sarah had never experienced before. Officers moved with urgent purpose through corridors that seemed to have doubled in population overnight. She sat in an interview room that smelled of instant coffee and disinfectant, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Through the small window she could see unmarked cars arriving every few minutes, their occupants wearing the same serious expressions as everyone else in the building. Detective Inspector James Crawford sat across from her, a man in his 40s with greying hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd been working since the early hours. Beside him was someone who'd introduced herself only as Agent Morrison from what Sarah assumed was a government agency. Morrison was younger, with sharp features and an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. "Mrs. Mitchell," Crawford began, his Yorkshire accent making his words feel familiar despite the circumstances. "I know this must be overwhelming, but we need to understand exactly what happened this morning." Sarah had already told the story 3 times to different officers, but she repeated it again, trying to include every detail she could remember. The horses' unusual behavior, the elaborate flower arrangements, the men in dark suits, and finally Thunder and Storm's inexplicable charge toward the manor grounds. Agent Morrison leaned forward. "You say the horses seemed agitated before you even saw the manor. Can you describe their behavior more specifically?" Thunder was pacing, which he does when he's worried about something. Storm was pawing the ground and making soft nickering sounds. They were both more alert than usual, like they sensed something wrong.
"And you've seen this behavior before?" Sarah nodded.
"Before storms, mostly. Once when there was a gas leak I couldn't smell. They seemed to have a sixth sense about danger." Morrison exchanged a glance with Crawford. "Mrs. Mitchell, what we're about to tell you is classified information. You'll need to sign some documents agreeing not to discuss it with anyone." The next hour transformed Sarah's understanding of what had happened. The flower arrangements at Thornfield Manor had been hiding sophisticated explosive devices, each one carefully positioned to maximize damage to a specific target. The manor had been rented by a terrorist cell that had spent months planning what would have been one of the most devastating attacks on British soil since World War II. The target, Morrison explained, was Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She was scheduled to visit Thornfield Manor tomorrow afternoon for a private viewing of their supposed historical renovation project. The entire event was a setup. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The Queen? The flowers were arranged in a pattern that would have created a kill zone encompassing the entire area where she would have been standing. The timing devices were set to detonate during the ceremonial presentation of the renovation plans. Crawford continued the explanation. Your horses destroyed 3 key components of the system. Without them, the entire network couldn't function properly. When our bomb disposal team arrived, they found that the remaining devices had been automatically disarmed by the system's fail-safe protocols. The magnitude of what Thunder and Storm had prevented was almost impossible to comprehend. If they hadn't charged through those flower beds, if they hadn't somehow known to target exactly the right displays, the Queen of England might have been killed less than 24 hours later. How many people knew about the Queen's visit? Sarah asked. Morrison's expression darkened. That's what makes this case so serious. The visit was classified at the highest levels. Only a handful of people in the government and security services knew about it. This was clearly an inside job. Over the following hours, Sarah learned more about the investigation than she ever wanted to know. The terrorist cell had been operating for over a year, using legitimate businesses as covers while they gathered intelligence and resources. The purchase of Thornfield Manor had been funded through a complex network of shell companies that investigators were still unraveling. The most disturbing discovery was how close they'd come to succeeding. The security sweep of the manor had been scheduled for later that day, just hours before the Queen's arrival. The bomb disposal team would have found the devices eventually, but by then it might have been too late to prevent the attack through other means. The timing of your horse's intervention, Morrison said, was absolutely critical. If they'd acted even a few hours later, we might not have been able to track down all the members of the cell. As Sarah listened to the details of the investigation, she began to understand the scope of what had been prevented. The attack wouldn't have just killed the Queen. It would have destabilized the entire British government and sent shockwaves around the world. The psychological impact of assassinating the monarch on British soil would have been immeasurable. But questions remained that no one seemed able to answer. How had Thunder and Storm known about the danger? Why had they acted so decisively and with such apparent purpose? Even Sarah, who'd lived with the horses for years, had never seen them behave with such determined focus. Has anything like this happened before? Crawford asked. Have your horses ever shown this kind of behavior around dangerous situations? Sarah thought carefully about the question. They've always been sensitive to danger, but this was different. This morning, it was like they had a mission. Thunder especially. He's never jumped a fence in his life, but he cleared that barrier like he'd been planning it for months. Agent Morrison made notes on her tablet. We're going to need to examine the horses, if that's all right with you. Our veterinary specialists want to run some tests to see if there's something unique about their sensory capabilities. The idea of subjecting Thunder and Storm to medical testing made Sarah uncomfortable, but she understood the necessity. If her horses possessed some unusual ability to detect explosives or other dangers, it could be invaluable for future security operations. The afternoon brought a parade of specialists to the police station. Bomb disposal experts wanted to understand exactly how the horses had known which displays to target. Animal behaviorists were fascinated by the apparent purposefulness of their actions. Security analysts were trying to determine if the horses could be trained to detect similar threats. Sarah found herself at the center of discussions that were far beyond her experience or expertise. Military officers spoke in acronyms she didn't understand, while scientists debated theories about equine sensory perception that sounded like something from a fantasy novel. Through it all, one question kept nagging at her. How had the terrorists learned about the Queen's visit? The investigation into the security leak was obviously ongoing, but Sarah sensed that the authorities were more worried about this aspect than they were letting on. Her answer came unexpectedly when Agent Morrison returned from a private phone call, her expression grim. Mrs. Mitchell, we need to discuss your safety. There's reason to believe that not all members of the terrorist cell have been apprehended. The words sent a chill through Sarah's body. What does that mean? Crawford leaned forward. It means that the people responsible for this plot know that your horses disrupted their plans. We have intelligence suggesting they may try to retaliate. The idea that she and Emma might be in danger because of Thunder and Storm's actions was terrifying. Sarah had never wanted to be involved in anything like this. All she'd wanted was a quiet life, raising her daughter and caring for her horses. "We're going to provide police protection for you and your daughter," Morrison continued, "and we'd like to move the horses to a secure facility where our specialists can study them safely. Moving them now would be cruel and probably dangerous." "Mrs. Mitchell," Morrison's voice carried a note of impatience, "you don't understand the gravity of the situation. These people are international terrorists with resources and connections we're still discovering. They won't hesitate to target you if they believe it'll further their goals." But Sarah had made up her mind. Thunder and Storm had spent their entire lives on the Mitchell farm. They knew every field, every path, every sound and smell of their home territory. Transplanting them to some sterile government facility would be traumatic for animals that were already high-strung and sensitive to their environment. "I'll accept police protection," she said, "but the horses stay where they are. If your specialists want to study them, they can come to the farm." The argument continued for another hour, with various officials trying to convince Sarah to change her mind. But she'd inherited more than just horses from Michael's family. She'd also inherited their stubborn determination when it came to protecting what they loved. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The horses would remain on the farm, but the property would be placed under 24-hour surveillance. A team of specialists would be stationed nearby to monitor Thunder and Storm's behavior and conduct their research without removing the animals from familiar surroundings. As evening approached, Sarah was finally allowed to return home. A police escort accompanied her, and she could see additional security vehicles taking positions around her property. The quiet countryside that had always been her refuge now felt like the center of an international incident. Emma was waiting in the kitchen, her school bag still packed and her face full of questions. The story Sarah would have to tell her 8-year-old daughter was almost impossible to believe, even having lived through it herself. "Mum, why are there police cars everywhere? And why do Thunder and Storm have people watching them?" Sarah sat down at the kitchen table and tried to find words that would explain the day's events without terrifying her daughter. How do you tell a child that her beloved horses had prevented the assassination of the Queen? How do you explain that ordinary Tuesday morning had somehow transformed into a matter of national security? "Thunder and Storm did something very important today," she began. "They helped the police catch some bad people who were planning to hurt someone very special." Emma's eyes grew wide. "Like superheroes?" Despite everything that had happened, Sarah found herself smiling. "Yes. Love. Exactly like superheroes." Outside, she could see the shadowy figures of security personnel taking their positions around the property. In the paddock, Thunder and Storm grazed peacefully, apparently unaware of the international incident they'd prevented or the attention their actions had attracted. The horses that had started the day as her private burden had somehow become the most famous animals in Britain. Tomorrow would bring reporters, government officials, and specialists from around the world, all wanting to understand how 2 Shire horses had saved the Queen's life. But tonight, Sarah just wanted to hold her daughter and try to process the reality that her quiet life in the Yorkshire countryside had been changed forever by the instinctive actions of 2 remarkable horses. 3 weeks after receiving royal recognition, Thunder and Storm's newfound fame brought dangers that Sarah had never anticipated. The story of 2 Shire horses saving the Queen had captured international attention, spawning documentary crews, book deals, and merchandising opportunities that Sarah politely declined. But the publicity also attracted the wrong kind of attention from people who viewed the horses not as heroes, but as symbols of their failure. The first sign of escalating threats came through Agent Morrison's increasingly frequent visits to the farm. Her briefings had taken on an urgency that made Sarah's stomach clench with worry. "We've intercepted communications suggesting that multiple terrorist cells are now specifically targeting your horses," Morrison explained during a tense morning meeting. "They see Thunder and Storm as symbols of Western resistance to their cause." Sarah set down her coffee mug with trembling hands. "What kind of threats are we talking about?" "Everything from kidnapping attempts to assassination plots." "These people understand the psychological impact of harming the animals that prevented their attack. If they can hurt Thunder and Storm, they believe it will demonstrate that nowhere in Britain is truly safe." The security arrangements around the farm had already been expanded twice since the royal visit, transforming the peaceful Yorkshire countryside into something resembling a military installation. Sarah counted no fewer than 16 personnel stationed around her property at any given time, their presence a constant reminder of the ongoing danger. Dr. Terrett Webb, the animal behavior specialist, had been monitoring Thunder and Storm's reactions to the increased security. His observations were troubling. "They're showing signs of stress," he reported during his weekly evaluation. "The constant presence of armed personnel, the electronic surveillance equipment, the disruption of their normal routines, It's taking a psychological toll on both animals. Sarah could see it herself. Thunder, normally confident and alert, had become skittish around strangers. Storm spent hours pacing the fence line, his attention focused on the perimeter guards rather than his usual interests in food and companionship. The horses that had once thrived on routine and familiarity were struggling to adapt to life under siege. Emma, now 9 years old, was having her own difficulties adjusting to their transformed circumstances. The constant security presence meant she couldn't roam freely around the farm, as she'd done all her life. Simple activities like riding her bicycle or playing in the garden required advanced planning and escort arrangements. "I miss when it was just us and the horses," she confided to Sarah one evening, as they watched thunder and storm from their kitchen window. "Everything feels scary now." Sarah's heart ached for her daughter's lost innocence. Emma had gone from being a carefree country child to living like the daughter of a head of state, surrounded by protection that served as a constant reminder of danger. The situation deteriorated rapidly when intelligence services detected active surveillance of the farm by unknown individuals. Camera footage from the expanded security system revealed people conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance missions along the public footpaths that bordered the property. "They're mapping your routines," Agent Morrison explained during an emergency briefing. "Vehicle movements, personnel rotations, vulnerable access points. This isn't casual interest. It's operational planning." The breakthrough in understanding the scope of the threat came from an unexpected source. Dr. Hartwell, the Royal Veterinarian, had been conducting ongoing research into thunder and storm's unique sensory capabilities when she made a discovery that changed everything. They're reacting to electronic surveillance equipment. She announced during a conference call that included Morrison, Crawford, and several government officials Sarah didn't recognize. Their behavior patterns showed distinct responses to various types of monitoring devices. The implications were staggering. If thunder and storm could detect surveillance equipment, they might be able to identify threats that conventional security measures missed. But it also meant they were living in a constant state of alert, aware of every electronic device monitoring their environment. "We need to consider relocating them," Morrison argued. "The current security arrangements are unsustainable long-term, and the horses are clearly suffering from the stress." "Absolutely not," Sarah replied firmly. "These animals have never lived anywhere but this farm. Moving them now would be traumatic beyond measure." But her resolve was tested when the first direct attempt to breach the property's security occurred on a fog-laden November morning. Sarah was awakened at 4 a.m. by the sound of alarms and shouting voices. Through her bedroom window, she could see security personnel running across the yard with weapons drawn. Agent Morrison appeared at her door within minutes, her face grim. "We've had an incursion. 3 individuals attempted to breach the perimeter near the horse paddock." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Are thunder and storm safe?" "They're secure, but the intruders got closer than they should have. We're conducting a full security review." The investigation revealed sophisticated planning and equipment that suggested professional operatives rather than amateur fanatics. The intruders had used military-grade night vision equipment, electronic jamming devices, and cutting tools designed to defeat the security fencing without triggering alarms. Most disturbing was evidence that they'd been studying the property for weeks, mapping guard rotations and identifying weak points in the surveillance system. Only the horses' alert behavior had prevented a successful breach. "Thunder started making that rumbling sound about 20 minutes before our sensors detected anything," Sarah told the investigators. Storm was pawing the ground and staring toward the fence line. Dr. Webb was fascinated by this development. "They detected the threat before your electronic systems did. Their sensory capabilities may be our best early warning system, but relying on horses as security guards was hardly a long-term solution." The stress was clearly affecting both animals, and Sarah worried about the psychological damage of living under constant threat. The situation reached a crisis point when intelligence agencies identified the source of the ongoing threats. A splinter group of the original terrorist network had formed specifically to target Thunder and Storm, viewing their destruction as essential to restoring their organization's credibility. "They call themselves the Retribution Cell," Morrison explained during what Sarah was beginning to think of as the daily crisis briefing. "They're funded by the same sources as the original plot, but they're operating independently with a single mission: eliminate the horses that prevented the Queen's assassination." The psychological profiles of the cell members made for disturbing reading. These weren't idealistic extremists fighting for political causes. They were professional killers motivated by revenge and the need to prove that their organization couldn't be defeated by farm animals. "They've already attempted operations in 3 other countries," Morrison continued. Each target was somehow connected to counter-terrorism successes. They bombed a cafe in Berlin where an informant had met with police. They kidnapped and killed a journalist in Paris who'd written about their network. This isn't random terrorism, it's systematic revenge. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her. Thunder and Storm had acted to protect her and her family, but their heroism had painted targets on everyone she loved. Emma was living under armed guard, their farm had become a fortress, and her horses were suffering from stress that was affecting their health. The breaking point came when Emma collapsed at school, overwhelmed by anxiety about potential threats to their family. The school nurse called it a panic attack, but Sarah recognized it as the inevitable result of a 9-year-old living under too much pressure for too long. That evening, as Sarah sat by Emma's bedside watching her daughter sleep fitfully, she made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't continue to sacrifice her child's well-being for the sake of protecting horses, no matter how heroic their actions had been. "I want to discuss relocation options," she told Morrison the next morning. Morrison's relief was evident. "We've identified several secure facilities that could accommodate Thunder and Storm while maintaining appropriate security protocols. But Sarah's plan was different from what the authorities expected. Rather than hiding the horses away in some government facility, she wanted to use their unique abilities in service to national security. If they can detect surveillance equipment and sense threats before your systems do, why not train them properly? Use their abilities to protect other potential targets?" The idea sparked intense debate among security professionals. Training horses for counter-terrorism work was unprecedented, but Thunder and Storm had already demonstrated capabilities that no human or electronic system could match. Dr. Webb was enthusiastic about the possibilities. "We could develop protocols that harness their natural abilities while providing them with the mental stimulation they need. Instead of being passive targets, they could become active participants in their own protection." The proposal required approval at the highest levels of government. Sarah found herself presenting her case to officials whose names she'd only seen in newspapers, arguing that her horses could serve their country better as working animals than as protected symbols. The decision, when it came, was as unexpected as everything else in this extraordinary story. Thunder and Storm would be inducted into a classified program that would train them alongside human security specialists, using their unique sensory abilities to detect threats that conventional methods might miss. "They'll still live on your farm," Morrison explained, "but they'll also have a job to do. 3 days a week, they'll work with security teams at high-value locations. The rest of the time, they'll be home with you and Emma." The arrangement offered hope for returning to some semblance of normal life. Emma would no longer have to live under siege conditions. The security presence around the farm would be reduced to manageable levels, and Thunder and Storm would have the mental stimulation they needed to thrive. But questions remained about the ongoing threat from the Retribution Cell. These people had proven their willingness to travel anywhere and wait as long as necessary to achieve their goals. Moving Thunder and Storm into active service would create new opportunities for attack, even as it provided better protection. "We're tracking their movements constantly," Morrison assured Sarah. "But they're patient and well-funded. This isn't over just because we're changing tactics." As Sarah prepared for yet another transformation in their lives, she reflected on how far they'd traveled from that quiet September morning when Thunder had first shown signs of agitation. Her horses had become heroes, celebrities, and finally security assets in a war she'd never chosen to join. The cottage that had once been her refuge from the world was now the center of an international security operation. The horses that had been her emotional anchors after Michael's death had become symbols of resistance against global terrorism. And her daughter, who should have been worried about homework and playground politics, was growing up in a world where armed guards were a normal part of daily life. But Thunder and Storm had saved the Queen's life and prevented multiple terrorist attacks through actions that still defied scientific explanation. If their unique abilities could be channeled to protect others, then perhaps some good could come from the chaos that had consumed their quiet Yorkshire farm. The war between heroes and terrorists was far from over, and Sarah Mitchell found herself reluctantly enlisted as a soldier in a conflict she was only beginning to understand. 6 months after Thunder and Storm began their service with the government's classified security program, Sarah's life had found a new rhythm that bore no resemblance to her previous existence. The horses transported in specially modified trailers to locations across Britain, working alongside security teams at events and installations where their unique abilities were most needed. Their success rate was remarkable: 17 potential security breaches detected, 4 assassination attempts prevented, and one major terrorist cell identified through their ability to sense surveillance equipment. Emma had adapted to their new reality with the resilience of childhood, though she'd grown up faster than any 9-year-old should. She understood that Thunder and Storm were heroes with important work to do, but she also missed the days when they were simply her horses rather than national assets. "Will it ever go back to normal?" she asked Sarah one evening as they watched the horses being loaded for another assignment. Sarah didn't have an answer. Normal was a concept that seemed increasingly foreign as the months passed. The farm was quieter now, with security reduced to a manageable level, but their lives revolved around the horses' work schedule rather than the seasonal rhythms of agriculture. Dr. Webb's training program had transformed Thunder and Storm from instinctive protectors into sophisticated detection specialists. They'd learned to signal different types of threats through specific behaviors: ear positions that indicated electronic surveillance, pawing patterns that revealed concealed weapons, and vocalizations that warned of explosive materials. They've retained their natural abilities while developing learned responses, Dr. Webb explained during one of his regular evaluations. "It's unprecedented in animal behavior research. They're essentially bilingual, communicating in both horse and human security protocols." Quote, "The horses' work had taken them to parliament buildings, royal residences, international conferences, and military installations. They'd walked beside world leaders, stood guard at state dinners, and provided early warning systems for events where thousands of lives hung in the balance. Their most significant success had come at a G7 summit, where Storm detected concealed recording equipment in a conference room that had already been swept multiple times by electronic countermeasures. The discovery led to the arrest of a spy ring that had been operating within the British government for over 3 years, but success brought its own dangers. The Retribution Cell had not abandoned their mission to eliminate the horses, and they'd grown more sophisticated in their attempts. Intelligence reports described training camps where operatives practiced tactics specifically designed to counter equine detection capabilities. "They're studying animal behavior the same way we are," Agent Morrison warned during a security briefing. "They understand that conventional approaches won't work against Thunder and Storm's abilities, so they're developing new methods." The psychological profile of the cell's leadership made for disturbing reading. These weren't desperate fanatics lashing out blindly. They were calculating professionals who viewed the horses as strategic targets in a broader campaign against Western security services. Sarah's role had evolved beyond simply caring for Thunder and Storm. She'd become their handler, translator, and advocate within a system that sometimes treated them more like equipment than living animals. Her ability to interpret their subtle behavioral changes had proven invaluable in operational settings. "You understand them better than anyone," Colonel Harrison, the program's military liaison, acknowledged. "Your presence makes them more effective and keeps them psychologically stable." But the constant pressure was taking its toll on all of them. Sarah found herself sleeping poorly, always alert for signs that the horses were detecting new threats. Emma had developed anxiety about her mother and the horses leaving for dangerous assignments. Even Thunder and Storm showed signs of stress from their high-stakes work environment. The crisis that would define their future began on a February morning when intelligence services detected unusual activity around multiple locations where the horses were scheduled to work. Surveillance teams reported suspicious individuals conducting reconnaissance at a children's hospital where Thunder and Storm were to provide security for a royal visit, a government building where they would screen visitors for concealed weapons, and the farm where they lived. "It's coordinated," Morrison explained during an emergency briefing. "They're not just targeting one location, they're planning simultaneous operations designed to overwhelm our response capabilities." The scope of the threat was unlike anything they'd faced before. The Retribution Cell had spent months mapping the horses' schedules, studying their working methods, and identifying vulnerabilities in the security protocols that protected them. "They've learned from every previous attempt," Colonel Harrison added. "This isn't random violence, it's a carefully planned military operation with multiple contingencies and backup plans." The decision to continue with the scheduled assignments was controversial. Sarah argued passionately for cancelling everything until the threats could be neutralized, but government officials feared that giving in to terrorist pressure would set a dangerous precedent. "If we stop using Thunder and Storm every time there's a threat, we might as well retire them permanently," Morrison pointed out. "These people will never stop trying as long as the horses are operational." The compromise was to increase security dramatically while maintaining the scheduled activities. Additional personnel were assigned to each location. Surveillance was expanded, and contingency plans were developed for every conceivable scenario. But Sarah's maternal instincts told her that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. The horses were showing signs of stress that went beyond their usual pre-assignment nervousness. Thunder was making the deep rumbling sound that indicated severe anxiety, while Storm was displaying hypervigilant behavior that suggested he sensed immediate danger. "They know something we don't," Sarah told Dr. Kra. "Webb, as they observed the horses on the morning of the planned operations. Their behavior is different from anything I've seen before." "Doctor," Webb's observations confirmed Sarah's concerns. "Their stress indicators are off the charts. They're reacting to something in their environment that our instruments can't detect." The revelation came through an unexpected source: Emma's pet rabbit, Coco, who lived in a hutch near the horse paddock. The rabbit had been acting strangely for several days, refusing to eat and hiding in the corner of her enclosure. When Dr. Webb examined the animal, he made a discovery that changed everything. "She's been drugged," he announced grimly. "Someone has been introducing sedatives into her food supply, probably as a test run for a larger operation." The implications were horrifying. If the retribution cell could access Emma's pet rabbit, they could potentially drug Thunder and Storm, compromising the horse's abilities and making them vulnerable to attack. Emergency testing revealed traces of sedatives in the horse's water supply, carefully measured doses designed to dull their senses without causing obvious symptoms. The discovery triggered a complete security overhaul and the immediate cancellation of all scheduled assignments. "They've been inside our perimeter for days," Morrison admitted during the crisis briefing that followed. "Everything we thought we knew about the security of this location was wrong." The investigation revealed a level of sophistication that shocked even experienced counterterrorism professionals. The retribution cell had infiltrated the farm's water system through underground pipes, using specialized equipment to introduce precise amounts of sedatives over an extended period. More disturbing was the discovery of observation posts in the surrounding countryside, camouflaged positions where operatives had been monitoring the farm's activities for weeks. The terrorists had compiled detailed intelligence on every aspect of Thunder and Storm's routines, from their feeding schedules to their exercise patterns. "They know more about your horses than most of our own security personnel," Colonel Harrison admitted. "This operation has been months in the planning, with resources that suggest state-level sponsorship." The final phase of the Retribution Cell's plan was revealed through intercepted communications that painted a picture of breathtaking audacity. They intended to capture Thunder and Storm alive, using them in a propaganda video that would demonstrate the vulnerability of British security before executing them in front of cameras. "It's not just about revenge anymore," Morrison explained. "They want to create a psychological impact that will undermine confidence in our entire security apparatus." Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. "We're leaving. Tonight. Take Emma and the horses somewhere safe and let these people have their empty victory." But Thunder and Storm had other ideas. As the evacuation preparations began, both horses became increasingly agitated, focusing their attention on the wooded area where intelligence services suspected the main terrorist camp was located. "They want to go after them," Dr. Webb observed with amazement. "Instead of fleeing from the threat, they're showing aggressive behavior directed toward the source of danger." The idea that formed in Sarah's mind was so audacious that she initially dismissed it as impossible. But the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Instead of running from the retribution cell, they could use the horse's unique abilities to locate and neutralize the terrorist threat. "You want to use Thunder and Storm as hunting animals?" Morrison asked incredulously when Sarah presented her plan. "I want to use them as they're meant to be used," Sarah replied. "They're not just detection equipment. They're intelligent animals capable of tracking and confronting threats. They've been trying to tell us where the terrorists are hiding." The operation that followed was unlike anything in the history of British counterterrorism. Thunder and Storm, accompanied by armed security teams and guided by their own instincts, led a coordinated assault on the Retribution Cell's hidden compound. The horses moved through the Yorkshire countryside with purpose and determination, their massive hooves carrying them toward enemies who had underestimated both their intelligence and their courage. They detected tripwires, located hidden sentries, and identified escape routes that conventional reconnaissance had missed. The final confrontation took place in a clearing where the terrorists had established their base of operations. Thunder and Storm charged into the camp with the fury of animals protecting their family, scattering armed operatives and creating the confusion necessary for security forces to complete their assault. When the smoke cleared, 17 members of the Retribution Cell were in custody, their plans disrupted and their leadership captured. The horses that had been marked for death had instead become the instruments of their enemies' defeat. The aftermath brought recognition that went far beyond medals and ceremonies. Thunder and Storm had proven that the bond between humans and animals could transcend traditional military doctrine, creating new possibilities for security operations that combined ancient instincts with modern technology. But for Sarah and Emma, the most important outcome was the return of peace to their Yorkshire farm. The threat that had dominated their lives for over a year was finally ended, and Thunder and Storm could return to being horses rather than weapons in an undeclared war. As they stood in their familiar paddock, wearing their royal medallions and bearing the scars of their extraordinary service, Thunder and Storm resumed the quiet routines of farm life. They grazed peacefully in fields that were once again safe, their vigilant intelligence tempered by the contentment of animals who had served their purpose and earned their rest. Emma, now 10 years old, and wise beyond her years, understood that her horses were heroes in the truest sense of the word. They had faced danger not for glory or recognition, but to protect the family they loved and the country they served. Sarah watched from her